Thank you, Cheryl. I'm Herb Hedden. I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Our speaker tonight is Paul Beck. Paul received his PhD in 1971 from the University of Michigan. He is currently Professor Emeritus and Academy Professor of Political Science at The Ohio State University. He served as the Political Science Department Chair for 19 years at 2 different universities. 13 of those years were at Ohio State. And he's also served as the Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Ohio State. In addition to that, he's also the International Co-Coordinator of the Comparative National Elections Project, which now includes almost 70 national election surveys conducted since 1990 in 31 different countries. In addition, over the course of his career, Paul has published 9 books and numerous articles in leading professional journals on voting behavior, political parties, and public opinion. He's received 5 research grants from the National Science Foundation, and he has become a regular commentator on politics in the media and before community and professional groups. He's also the recipient of the Distinguished Scholar and Distinguished Service Awards from the Ohio State University and the American Political Science Association's awards for distinguished service to the profession and career professional contributions to the field of political organizations and parties, respectively. In preparation for tonight, Paul has given quite a bit of thought to a very sobering topic, but one that begs our close attention as citizens. His topic is entitled Threats to Democracy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage a true expert on the topic at hand, Professor Paul Beck.
Is this on?
No. The big question is, can you hear me? Barely. Okay. There it is. Now can you hear me? Now can I put the microphone back in the receptacle? Well, I'm really delighted to be here. My wife and I moved from Worthington to Upper Arlington back in November, so we're quite happy to be here in Upper Arlington. I also should mention, by the way, before I get into my talk, that if I've said something that you don't really understand and you want me to elaborate on it, put your hand up and let me know that, and I'd be glad to redouble my efforts. If you have comments, if you have questions later on, save them for the end of the talk. If you've brought tomatoes with you, I don't see any right here. Wait until I've left, and then you can be sure to use those. The history of this talk is kind of interesting. I was giving a talk about, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was on the Ohio primary. And at the end of the talk, in sort of a parting line, I said, well, of course, 2024 is a year where there are serious threats to democracy, maybe more serious than we've ever had, at least since the Civil War, maybe before that. And somebody in the audience came up afterwards and said, well, can't you give a talk on that? And I thought, well, there are just too many of them. I don't know how I'm going to be able to cram all of this into a 45-minute to an hour talk. But I've tried to do it today. There will be things that I have left out. I've also put it together in such a way that I maybe can appeal to a mixed audience. Okay, well, let me begin. And what I'd like to do is start out cross-nationally. These are troublesome times for democracies. There is a rise of authoritarian governments across the globe. The most recent one being India, by the way. India is having an election coming up very soon. And that government appears to be more and more and more both nationalistic and certainly authoritarian. But the Philippines, Brazil, El Salvador, Venezuela, Iran, Turkey, Hungary, China, Russia. It's a long and very undistinguished list of countries. I think we live in an era where 20 years ago people were excited about the rise of democracies and the spread of democracy across the world. We now, I think, live in an era where we're questioning whether that rise in democracies continued and is going to continue into the future. One can hope, and the one thing about authoritarian governments is they don't typically perform very well. And if they haven't exerted total control over the population, which some have, populations have an opportunity, or voters have an opportunity to dethrone them. And this just happened recently in Poland, and you may have watched that, and there's very interesting developments there. Now, in the U.S., I think the threats for democracy are greater than we've ever seen since the Civil War. When I used to say comments like that to my classes, I realized that I hadn't been around a long time, so I couldn't see these things firsthand. Most of the students thought I was there since the Civil War, but what do they know? But there's several things that I want to just say at the outset, and then I'll come back to some of these. We have deepening partisan polarization among both voters and certainly among leaders. You see this clearly in the Congress, but you see it in state legislatures as well. And I have a figure there that I want to share with you and talk about a little bit. Oops. There we go. Okay. This is a figure that comes from surveys that were conducted by the American National Election Studies, done at the University of Michigan. And in fact, I got my training in the ANES many, many years ago. And one of the questions they ask is, how would you evaluate the current candidates for president on a feeling thermometer that ranges from 0, meaning really cold, to 100, meaning really warm or really hot? And what I've done there is taken the ends of those particular feeling thermometers and trying to show you what's happened to political polarization over time. And the bottom line is that it's increased, and it's increased dramatically among both Democrats and Republicans. It's important to bear that in mind. It almost takes two to dance, right? And so you're seeing, as Republicans have become more extreme, many Democrats, of course, are repulsed by that and move to the other extreme as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The thing about polarization that is so dangerous is that as you get to the extremes, did I lose this? As you get to the extremes on this scale, this feeling thermometer, people begin to see the other side as enemies and their side as friends. And you see more and more of that. If you look at the figures right here, what I plotted are both Democrats and Republicans, self-identified Democrats and Republicans. And these are people who see the candidate on their side in very warm terms, and the candidate on the other side in very cold or negative terms. And you see that's climbed over time. And those two tracks pretty much parallel one another as they've climbed over time. We've now reached a point, again, depending on how you measure, but we've reached a point, at least on this particular figure here, where a clear majority of Americans are polarized. A clear majority of Americans. And those of you who see yourselves as kind of in the middle almost feel alone in the middle because everybody else is on one side or the other. And that's what this chart is trying to show you here. I could do the same and have for other talks I've given for members of Congress. And that polarization has increased over time there in terms of voting patterns. There, the real drivers of that have been the Republicans. They've become more extreme over time than the Democrats have, even though there clearly is polarization as well there. So deepening partisan polarization, which is going to be kind of a constant theme as I go through this talk today. There also has been an erosion of the norms of civility and courtesy that are very much the guardrails of democratic politics. Politics, as you know, you've been involved in, it is a messy business. And there's a lot of fighting that goes on there. But in the end, 20, 30 years ago, there was much more civility and collegiality than you see right now. And that's been a big change as well. You've also seen the emergence of what I will call hard to compromise issues. It's very hard to pick the issue of abortion, for instance, to stake out a claim that, well, abortion's all right, but there's probably too much of it, or abortion is killing children, fetuses, and therefore it ought to be totally illegal. Other issues are easier to compromise. Issues as to what the tax rate ought to be, for instance. There's always room for compromise there. But you've seen issues move onto the agenda that are much more difficult to try to compromise, which means that people are at the extremes on those issues. I don't have to tell you that political debate has become more vituperative. The other side, the opponents, are very much demonized by one prominent candidate that we can think of off the bat, but by others as well. There's also an increased influence of ideological interest groups. Many of them emanating from Washington, D.C., a lot of money there. Again, this has been an increase over time, and some of my political science colleagues have tracked this over time to show you how the interest group world has become both more ideological in orientation and more active in political campaigns than they used to be. And then what you've seen, and certainly for many of you, you've witnessed this in your lifetime, there's been a move from broadcasting where when you watch the news in the evenings, and it was in the evenings, you were seeing 3 networks, if you were lucky enough to live in an area that had all 3 networks, that were engaged in broadcasting. They were trying to present the news in a way that was more or less balanced, and sometimes they succeeded in doing this, but sometimes they didn't. But by and large, the broadcast news in those days was fairly balanced in terms of its coverage. In fact, I measured that back in 1992, and there was a lot of balance there, despite the feelings of some people. We've moved now to narrowcasting. If you want to find a news source that reinforces everything you believe, it's pretty easy to find it. And in fact, it's almost unregulated. Certainly cable news is not regulated in any strict sense. And then, of course, if you go to the social media, which has become more and more common these days, and more common in the sense that many of our children and grandchildren are deriving much of their news from the social media, and snippets that appear there, but snippets that often are very, very extreme. One other thing that I'll mention in passing, and I'm not going to really talk about this in any detail, is that we've seen vigorous assaults on the rule of law. And they kind of undergird everything that I'm going to talk about. I think you see them most dramatically if you've watched the trial in recent days. A real challenge to the rule of law there, and of course that's a dangerous thing for democracies as well. Okay, I've been trying to identify a small number of threats to democracy just because there's too much out there to be able to cover everything. And what I want to feature today and talk about today are 4 of them. One is threats to the electoral process itself. Secondly, threats to the governance of the country, particularly at the national level, but also at the state and local level, and the policy-making process. Thirdly, threats to free and open political discourse. And finally, in an odd sort of way, threats to the party system itself, the party system as we have known it. So let me begin with the threats to the electoral process. Free and fair elections, as I think you know, are centerpieces of democracy, and their legitimacy is very much under attack these days. It's under attack in a variety of ways. One is in terms of actually who votes. Did I just fade out? Okay, is that better? Okay. It may be where I'm standing, actually. But assaults or attacks on who votes. And here I think the issue is, on the more Republican side, a feeling that there are too many people voting, and too many people voting who aren't going to vote the right way. And so there's been this assault in the name of trying to rid the electoral process of fraudulent voting. Those who have studied this in any detail find no evidence whatsoever of fraudulent voting, more than just a few traces of it here and there, but nothing that has really significantly impacted elections. Nonetheless, that doesn't stop the attack on the electoral process in the guise of trying to rid it of fraudulent voting. Democrats, by and large, have believed in easy access to the ballot. We should make it easy for people to be able to vote by removing all kinds of impediments that might be placed in their way in terms of voting. And let me just kind of tick off a few things. There have been restricted access to the ballot in recent years through registration rules that in some states have been stricter than they were 15 and 20 years ago. Through purges of the electoral roster. We've seen it here in Ohio. Now, the interesting thing about purges is that one does need to purge the electoral rolls on a regular basis. People move, people die, people decide to just not vote any, and haven't voted in elections for a long time. What's been interesting to me is that Ohio, up until, what was it, a year ago, or maybe a little more than a year ago, was engaged in an interstate agreement to try to share registration rolls across the states to see if there were people who were voting in more than one state. And I don't know about you, I moved, it was quite a while ago, but I didn't think to tell the state of Florida, which is where we moved from, that we no longer live there. But I certainly didn't vote there anymore. And I remember, and this is an anecdote that I've told often, that I had a neighbor when we lived in Florida who at a neighborhood party said to me, he singled me out as a political scientist, and he said, "Oh, I vote both in Ohio and Florida." He said, "I own property in both states." He was from Columbus, actually. I own property in both states. I have a stake in what happens there. And I said, "Well, that would be illegal." And he said, "Yeah, but you know, nobody has caught me, and I don't really identify this. I didn't remove my registration status in Ohio. I pay taxes such as they are in Florida. The reason I moved to Ohio, or from Ohio to Florida, was I didn't want to pay an income tax that Ohio had." So anyway, the point that I want to make here is that there are people who engage in fraudulent voting because they're voting in two different places, two different states. I don't think there are very many of them. They often get caught. But every once in a while, this happens. That probably is more common than any other kind of fraudulent voting. I was giving a talk once to actually a Republican women's group, and this woman in the audience raised her hand and she said, "And I just was at the Morse Road Board of Elections to vote early, and there were a whole bunch of illegals there who were voting." And my first thought was, I wasn't quick enough on the response, or as quick as I should have been. My first thought was, now wait a minute, if I were an illegal, the last thing I'd ever want to do is show up at a polling place and be identified. And then I later found out that most of them were Somalis who were citizens and eligible to vote and were exercising the right to vote in a way that they cherished, because they didn't really have that right in their home country. There have been reductions in early voting windows here in Ohio and elsewhere. There have been changes in absentee voting deadlines to make it harder for people to vote absentee. There also have been challenges to student voting on campus. When I lived in Ann Arbor many years ago, students who were from out of state and even out of Washington County could not vote in local elections. And the town fathers, and I think they were mostly fathers at the time, didn't want them to vote because they were fearful of how they would vote. Well, then there was a state Supreme Court decision that ruled that indeed, if they would register to vote, they were eligible to vote in Washington County. And the next thing you knew, there was a new city council in the city of Ann Arbor, and the first thing that city council did was legalize marijuana. So, you know, things change over time. Elections matter. They didn't matter for long. I think the town fathers recaptured things before too long. So anyway, there have been also in the category of who votes, there have been rollbacks in increased ballot access that was granted during the pandemic. Most states, in their wisdom, wanted to make it easier for people to vote during the pandemic. And so they would establish multiple places where you could drop off a ballot. They made it easier for people to vote absentee. Many states have rolled those things back, going back to the way things were before the pandemic itself. And then, of course, what we know is there have been challenges to actually who counts the ballots, who counts the votes. The traditional model in the United States has been a model that I think has worked pretty well over more than a century. And that is that you have bipartisan election boards, you have the opposite sides, Republicans and Democrats, watching each other. And that was the guarantee that you would have free and fair elections. Didn't always work that way. I grew up near Chicago, and in Chicago, in the time at least when I was a child, there probably wasn't free and open voting in the city of Chicago. That changed over time, but I think the election rolls now are, in terms of who counts the votes, pretty clean, but there's a challenge to that. And the challenge is that we should make, in some states, state legislatures do the counting. It's a frightening thought, isn't it, in Ohio? But nonetheless, there are alternatives that are being proposed to this tried and true method of bipartisanship in terms of the state and local boards of elections. There also are challenges to who certifies the results. And I'm getting behind myself here in terms of the PowerPoint. Bipartisan state boards are often certifying things. Party legislative majorities have been proposed as certifiers of the vote. Did I fade out again? I don't know why that's happening. How's that? Is that better? Okay. There have been some proposals that state legislatures ought to be the ones to do certification, and this would be a legislative majority. That governors ought to do this, that the courts ought to do it, that Congress ought to do it, or that the incumbent president should be the one who would certify the vote. So again, threats to the electoral process itself that I think strike at the very foundations of democracy. And what we know in other countries is the thing that citizens value the most there is the ability to cast a vote in a free and open election. And I think that's at risk in the United States, and I worry a lot about that. Trump and his allies obviously have challenged the legitimacy of the electoral process. They continue to question the 2020 result. Support of that view is, again, I think it faded out. Yeah, it's back. Support of that view now is a loyalty test. And if you don't support that view, you're not going to be able to be in Trump's favor later on. That's a frightening thought, isn't it? He has threatened to challenge the result again if he loses. Now, if he wins, I think, if he wins in a fair and free election, I think he'll say, fair and free election, of course. There were more people who wanted to vote for me, and their votes were discounted, but still, I have won. If re-elected, he promises to pardon the hostages, quote, end quote, convicted of federal crimes in the January 6th attack on the Capitol and related efforts to try to change the outcome of the 2020 election. He pardoned, while he was still president, Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and others. He is pledged to quash any continuing investigations. I don't do anything, but it fades out. Is it back? Oh, okay. He's pledged to quash any continuing investigations of him. And then, of course, the question is, would he leave office willingly if he's elected to a second term? And I think he said recently that he would. But do you trust him? I don't. Okay. Let me turn from threats to the electoral process to threats to the governmental process. And it's become clear in recent months just how deep those threats are. There's a document that all of you should probably take a look at called the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. And it is a promise or a pledge. It's a 900-page document, by the way. And many of the things that are in there have been in the Heritage Foundation's project for a long time. And you'll recognize them as things that previous speakers. Is it back? Yeah, it keeps fading in and out again for I think it's probably, would he be monitoring this talk? Probably not. I'm not a conspiratorialist, although I'm becoming one more and more. Anyway, the Heritage Foundation has this Project 2025, which is a promise to, quote, reshape federal government to support a Republican president. There are all kinds of provisions in here. There are cuts to the Justice Department, to the FBI, to Homeland Security, to the intelligence community, to regulations of the climate and the environment. They would eliminate the Commerce Department and the Education Department. They would bring the independent agencies, including the Federal Reserve. Did it fade out again? No, it's still there. They would bring the independent agencies under presidential control, so they would basically be run from the White House. And they would be run by people not on fixed terms that transcend a presidential term, but rather at the will of the president. And that's a proposal that is in this Project 2025. And then about, a week ago, 2 weeks ago maybe, there was this Time Magazine interview with Donald Trump in which he reiterates many of the things that are in Project 2025 and many of the things that he has said in the past. And I think all of us have learned to believe what he says he's going to do, because there's one area where he's quite honest, actually. And that is when he makes these pledges and these promises, he does try to carry them out. Again, okay, is it back? So I think that we need to listen to what he is saying. The Project 2025 also proposes to reduce spending for the social safety net. Trump, by the way, has demurred on that, saying he's going to protect Social Security and Medicare. Again, I'm not sure that I believe him. Republicans in Congress, I think, would like to cut them and reduce them, certainly reduce Medicaid and turn Medicaid even more fully over to the states with lower levels of financing. And then there's a desire in Project 2025 to implement conservative social policies almost across the board. There also are other features that I want to mention. Under the Insurrection Act of 1807, the military would be used in law enforcement at the state and local level. And the Justice Department, it is proposed, would investigate the president's adversaries enemies of the president. Also, one of the things that is new about Project 2025 is that they're assembling a list of 20,000 loyal Trump followers who would be the panel they would draw from in putting people into federal government positions. Along with that, they really are proposing to return to 19th century patronage practices, where there would be more government workers who would not have civil service protection, and we're talking about probably hundreds of thousands who would be stripped of civil service protection. And these would be people who would be direct appointees of the president and, of course, would be loyal to the president. And then there's a proposal to use the military to jail enemies and to round up undocumented immigrants and put them into, quote, concentration camps. And no, I should quote that. They don't say concentration camps. They say detention camps. And again, we're talking about, I think, hundreds of thousands of people, including, anybody who's undocumented, including dreamers, would be in that category as well. There also are claims now, not so much in Project 2025, but from Trump himself, to unlimited presidential immunity. And of course, the Supreme Court right now is adjudicating that. We wait with bated breath to see what they actually are going to come up with there. I'm not optimistic, even though I'm an optimist in general. But the last decade has led me to believe that optimism sometimes is not really very warranted. The president also, the ex-president, has also threatened to abrogate treaty obligations on his own with NATO, with foreign trade, even though their Congress has given the president considerable powers to negotiate foreign trade deals on his own. They may come to regret that.
Trade out.
Okay, we're going to trade this. Is this one working now? Is it? Yeah, is this okay? Okay. Let me go ahead and I'll just hold this rather than. See, I can use technology if Cheryl is willing to help me do that. So anyway, the threat to treaty obligations, and of course the whole package that we're talking about here undermines the norms against favoritism in federal actions. Policies that are based on loyalty to the president, policies that are based on transactional advantages for the president, and this is a really frightening thought. We did away with patronage 150 years ago, at least at the federal level. It was a slow process. We didn't really do away with it at the state and local level until more modern times. In fact, I remember going to, I think it was to get a driver, no, it wasn't a driver's license, something I needed when I lived in Pittsburgh, where I had to go down to one of the county offices. And the clerk there, wouldn't wait on me. And I was puzzled as to what was going on there. And then I told a friend of mine who was a lawyer in downtown Pittsburgh. She said, well, how much did you tip them? And I said, well, I didn't think I should have to tip them. And she said, oh, yes. This is still, in this case, the democratic machine running things. And you need to make sure that you appreciate what they're doing. Well, that ended pretty quickly in Pittsburgh, but maybe not quickly enough. And then the other thing, and I'll come back to this later on, if you picture what would happen under a Trump presidency, you should picture a president who basically is primarily motivated by the desire for retribution against enemies. And that's a sad, frightening picture, isn't it? The policy changes would be bad enough, but the fact that the federal government, the executive branch, would be marshaled to get the enemies. And in fact, I tell my corporate executive friends, I don't have many, but there are a few, that of course you tomorrow could be an enemy. And you need to be aware of that. That if you cross him in any way, he could subject you to scrutiny from the IRS, from the Justice Department, and the like, because he very much is somebody who believes in retribution against people who are not loyal to him. Okay, this I've covered already. Let me now turn to the threats to free and open discourse. And the framers themselves recognize the importance of freedom of speech and of assembly itself. The authoritarian playbook, as we've seen in country after country after country over the years, aims to monopolize communication channels. So there really is no alternative source of information for ordinary citizens. They do it in a variety of ways. They want to undermine independent media. And if you've watched what's going on in Hungary in the last couple of decades, you can see a steady progression of that by the Orban government there, where he has taken away advertising that governments used to place in newspapers, and well, I think they were mostly newspapers, and given that advertising to his friends and allies and a variety of other things. Loyal media are enlisted to support the president. And you see this with the National Enquirer in this current trial that's going on. I never imagined how much they were enlisted to support the president and the kinds of things that they did. I was naive. Indeed, they were engaged in active propagandizing to support him. Fox News is in the same category. Well, not quite, but almost. And of course, it's been the mouthpiece of the Trump campaign and the Trump administration ever since. The other thing that doesn't get much talked about is that there can be challenges under a new Trump administration to network licenses. The networks are licensed by the FCC. And one can imagine challenges by the new FCC commissioners appointed by the president, loyal to the president, to deny them licenses. And of course, what usually happens under those kinds of circumstances is that they don't have to really, in the end, deny the licenses. What they can do is they can intimidate people, executives in these particular networks, into towing the line for fear that their license is going to be revoked in one way or another. And one of the worries I have as a lover of public broadcasting is that there would be an attempt, even more an attempt than there's been in the past, to try to cut off any kind of federal subsidies for public broadcasting. Interestingly, the big defenders of public broadcasting, where it really mattered, were Republicans in Congress from rural districts and small towns, where the only source of news and information was through the public station in that locale. They pretty much have saved public broadcasting from salvos in the past to try to simply defund it. Whether they would be able to do so in the future or not, who knows. There also, in this category of threats to free and open discourse, has been a degradation of the language of political discourse. Vicious, insensitive personal attacks on opponents, the demonization of opponents as hated enemies rather than just adversaries with different views. I'm reminded of John McCain here, who, when a woman in the audience came up to him with nasty comments about Obama, a Muslim, I don't remember the full text of that, McCain, to his credit, said, "No, ma'am, you're wrong. He is a decent person, a decent family man. I just happen to disagree with him on policy matters." Well, there are very few John McCains around anymore who would indeed stand up to that kind of assault. There also is a persistent use of what are called false equivalences to depict the other side as just as bad, undermining the legitimacy of the political process itself. Finally, let me talk about threats to the party system as we have known it. The Trump, well, I'm not saying it right. Trump engaged in a hostile capture of the Republican Party. And it was a big prize because it comes with it loyalists, people who are Republican loyalists. And if you can capture the Republican nomination, which he did, you get their support in the general election. How big is that base? It may be 35 to 38% of the Trump or of the electorate. And in fact, what's been happening, and it's a disturbing trend, is that there's been a growth in people who are Republican identifiers and a little bit of a decline in people who self-identify as Democrats. Now, these things come and go over time, but that to us progressives and Democrats is not a very happy kind of piece of data. He's defined the party in two important ways. One is in terms of policy. It's a much more populist party than it was, much more trying to appeal to a white working class base. It's a much more Christian nationalist party. It's much more socially conservative on a whole variety of issues. Abortion certainly being one of them, but there are others as well. It's become an anti-free trade party and a desire to, in fact, I think he said it recently in this Time interview, to impose 100% tariffs on certain countries that are shipping goods into the United States. Did this fade again? Okay, it's me, not so much the technology. It's a much more isolationist party than it was before. Now, there's always been this current of isolationism within the Republican Party. It goes all the way back into the 50s and even prior to World War II. But it's kind of reawakened in recent years. And Trump has been a main driver of that. And then, of course, beyond well, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's a denial of global warming as well. And you would see that even more clearly in a second Trump administration than we've seen in the first Trump administration. And then it goes beyond policy. I already mentioned this. It's fueled by Trump's thirst for revenge, for retribution, for resentment, or as a vehicle of his resentment. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. And I think it's even more powerful than the policy changes that would take place under a Trump administration. And then the other thing that's been happening in this campaign is that party donations have been siphoned off to Trump. Not just to pay his legal fees, and there's been plenty of that, and not just with the Republican National Committee agreeing to pay many of his legal fees, but he also recently announced to candidates who were using his name in their campaigns that they needed to kick back to him a share of the donations. And the share was only 5%, but I say only 5% because if it is lucrative to him and he needs more money to pay his legal fees, you can bet that it will go up over time. And I think the real question is what the party will look like after Trump. And there will be an after Trump if we live long enough to see that, I guess. But the question is, has the party been changed in so dramatically a fashion that it'll never be the same? And I think the answer is that it probably has been. But we will see this. There's been a realignment of the electoral bases of both the Democratic and the Republican Party. The GOP is more dependent on white, less educated voters. Reagan's Republican Party is gone. It's no longer there. You saw this, I think, most dramatically in the Senate primary here on the Republican side of the aisle. Two prominent Republican leaders, the governor and the sitting senator at the time, endorsed a candidate who lost to somebody that Trump had endorsed, whose percentage in the polls went up by about 20 to 25% once the Trump endorsement came along. The percentages for Dolan temporarily went up a little bit, but they didn't stay there. And in fact, what happened, it was an incredible result, was that Bernie Moreno won a majority of the votes in the Republican primary. And that's unusual in a three-person primary. And that was on the crest of the Trump endorsement. And it was really kind of signaling, it seems to me, that DeWine and Portman are no longer relevant to Republican voters. And that has implications, of course, for what's going to happen in 2026 in the gubernatorial race. Also, we've seen, and I think we saw it in the Ohio primary, but in other primaries as well, that with the dominance of primaries, and particularly with the endorsements on the Republican side of ex-President Trump, parties have lost their ability to filter out extremists. And party leaders in the past have always felt that extremists were dangerous because they basically threatened their ability to win the general election in the fall. That's no longer something that the primary voters think about. They want to vote for the candidate who has got the right endorsement and who ideologically is somebody who is compatible with what they want. Okay, now let me turn, and I'm going to be very rapid in talking about this. To the causes of these threats to democracy, there are a lot of them. And I'm only going to touch on a few here. And it's hard to kind of sort out which ones are more prominent, more important than others. And these sources date back decades. You could look basically, I think, probably to the period of the 1980s, when the sources of Trumpism began to emerge even before there really was a Trump active in Republican politics. The architect in the 1980s was Newt Gingrich, of all people. And Gingrich argued that what Republicans ought to do to be able to change decades of Democratic control of Congress, what they should do is attack the Democrats on everything and force the Democrats to take votes on issues that they didn't want to vote on because they could be used against them in political campaigns. And Gingrich was successful. That was a successful strategy. And the Republican Party over time became more and more the party of no, of opposing any policies that were advanced by the Democrats. And of course, as I said before, there's been growing polarization between Democrats and Republicans, with GOP candidates for office becoming more extreme and adopting strategies that are in opposition to the Democrats. All of this has been taking place as elections have become closer and closer. We have a situation in this country, and you go back even a decade or more, where there are no longer landslide elections for president. The elections are pretty tight. You can get a different result in the popular vote than you get in the Electoral College. If you look at congressional elections, there are a lot of safe seats there. The estimate is that only about 10%, even less than that, of U.S. House races this year are going to be at all competitive. So that means that fewer than 43 House contests are going to determine who controls the House of Representatives going forward. And we're in a situation where there are fewer split Senate delegations, where one senator is of one party, the other senator of the other party. There are fewer of them than there have ever been in over a century. And so what we're seeing there is close contests, a lot of safe seats, but safe seats that are guaranteeing election typically for incumbents, people who have been winners in the primary, sometimes very extreme, more so on the Republican side than on the Democratic side these days. But nonetheless, very competitive elections, which means the stakes are higher. And if you think about it, if you were a Democratic or a Republican politician, and your party barely won the White House or barely won the Congress, The last thing you might want to do is rub your opponent's face in this by trying to pass really extreme legislation. That hasn't happened. It's almost as if the parties think once we're in control, particularly if we control both houses of Congress and the presidency, we better take this as the opportunity to enact our agenda. Even if 4 years later voters will vote us out of office and the other party will come in and enact its agenda. And again, the best example of that is Obamacare, right? And I think that Trump has said in this Time interview that if elected president, again, he would improve health care and get rid of Obamacare, of course. You also have in both the media and in interpersonal networks, just kind of ordinary networks of ordinary people, the emergence more and more of what we academics call echo chambers, where the people you're talking to in your interpersonal interactions are people who basically agree with you. And I think we've all probably experienced this. You're fearful of old Uncle John at the Thanksgiving table. You don't want to have any kind of political discussion there because you know what he thinks. And you know that he is not at all reluctant to tell you what he thinks. And so we are more and more embedded in these echo chambers. And some of my own research has been focused on showing this not only in the United States but in other countries as well. And there's been an increase in the United States, the extent to which we discuss politics with people who are like us and don't discuss it with people who aren't like us and who might disagree with us. The United States, by the way, and I didn't say this before, but I should have, is probably the most polarized country politically in the world. Israel may come close, but we don't have, or at least I don't have, good surveys in Israel, but there's considerable polarization going on there. Brazil was very close to the United States in its last presidential election, almost tied with us, a very bitterly fought election, deeply polarized electorate. The only country that had more polarization, at least in the studies that I've done, is Mozambique, and you may not pay much attention to what's going on in Mozambican politics, and I didn't until we did a survey there. But 10 years before we had conducted the survey, Mozambique had had a civil war. And the estimate is that 200 to 300,000 people were killed in the civil war. It was a tribal war. And the two parties that were running in the election that we were studying were the parties that represented the warring tribes. And so there was a lot of polarization in that election. It was a percentage or two higher than it was in the United States at that time. So we are in a dubious category of being one of the most polarized countries in the world. Well, let me come to some conclusions. Oh, I forgot to mention social media, which of course has contributed to this as well. Okay, let me come to some conclusions before we turn to the Q&A. If re-elected, will Trump threats to democracy increase? I think we can bet on that, right? He's signaling that. We know that's going to happen. His past behavior is rhetoric. The plans of both this Project 2025 and the plans he outlined in his Time interview, and you should read that. If you take any kind of blood pressure medication, I would encourage you to double the dosage as you're reading it, because it indeed is chilling. Even his election itself may result from an anti-democratic electoral process, and we need to be alert to that as well. Now, in terms of false equivalence, there are a lot of charges that Biden himself is a threat to democracy. And I think there's no way that you can demonstrate that. And in some ways, what I think people are fearful of who oppose Biden is that through a democratic election, he will be given the power to enact policies that they don't like. But it would in many ways be a symbol of how democracy operates, that elections matter. And with the election, the re-election of Joe Biden, you would get maybe a doubling down on some of the things that he was eager to enact before. Equally serious, I think, are the threats to dismantle the constitutional order, to give more power to the president, unchecked power to the president. The framers really did not want to create another king. They already had that. And so they tried to check and balance power at the national level. They tried to restrain presidential power. It's not incidental, by the way, that the first article in the Constitution is the article that sets out the powers of Congress. It's the second article that sets out the powers of the president. And many of those powers are shared with the Congress. The veto power being one of them. Congress can override a veto. And so the framers do not cotton to the idea and can't be shown to support the idea that is current in the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, to basically endow him with the powers of a king. I think the checks on presidential power that we have right now would wither if Trump is reelected. There would be more control over the courts than there is right now. Congress would be, I think, if Trump were reelected, a Republican majority in both houses of the Congress, and they would simply bow down to whatever he wanted to do in terms of policy or in terms of appointments. And to reiterate something that I've said before, which is, I think, really frightening, that you would see a Trump presidency that is dominated by revenge, by retribution against his enemies. Now, there's an historical lesson here. Authoritarians are empowered. They were in Germany in the 1930s and in Italy in the 1920s and in other places as well, because the elites are complicit, because the elites allow it to happen. And we're seeing a lot of that right now. I think there's very little evidence that Republican leaders Okay, now I'm on the right page. There's very little evidence that Republican leaders would resist a second Trump presidency. And the other thing that's happened, and this has happened kind of behind the scenes, is that establishment Republicans, the DeWines and the Portmans, have been replaced by Trump loyalists. And you could see people saying, I don't want to serve in Congress any longer because I don't like what's going on. Here, these are, in many cases, Liz Cheney is a good example, conservative Republicans. But they don't like the kowtowing to, in the Trump presidency, to the Trump presidency itself and to its aftermath. Why have most Republican leaders followed Trump? In some ways, it's a mystery to me, although I think I understand it. One, of course, is that the Republican leadership now has changed, with more people who are supporters of Trump and loyalists to Trump moving in to those positions. People who've been endorsed by Trump as they're running in the primaries and are going to be loyal to him if they are elected to Congress or other positions. There also, I think, is a fear of electoral retribution from the Republican voter base. It's a changed Republican voter base from what it was in the past. And politicians, elected office holders, are fearful of that. We're in a period where we are dominated by grievance politics. I think on both sides of the aisle. I think that Americans are in a sour mood these days. It's easier to complain about things than it is to be positive about them. I think it's more pronounced, of course, on the Republican side, mainly because their leader, Republican soon-to-be nominee Trump, is the very epitome of grievance politics. I think also there are a number of Republicans who will support Trump because of policies. They favor the tax cuts that were enacted in the last few years. Those tax cuts, by the way, are going to expire by the end of 2025, and there's a lot of desire to be able to renew them over time and maybe even enlarge them. They're in favor of deregulation of business, particularly when it comes to environmental controls. They're very much in favor of the kind of judicial appointments that have been made or were made in the Trump administration. They're isolationists. They don't want to see American money spent to support Ukraine. They're more supportive of support for Israel. On the other hand, not all of them are supportive of that and funding for Israel. They certainly are embracing the denial of global warming. And one of the major achievements, I think, of the Biden administration is all the climate change initiatives that have been enacted in that administration. Those would be rolled back under a Trump administration. And they are conservative evangelicals who are very much supporting not a president they see as religious and evangelical himself, but rather a president they see as somebody who would enact the kinds of policies that they want, regardless of what he thinks. Now, let me conclude. If you want to read more about these kinds of things, there is a lot of literature out there, really a lot of good work out there that are covering the kinds of themes that I've talked about today. Two of them have to do with the politics of grievance. There's a new book, I think it just came out at the end of April, by Frank Bruni, called The Age of Grievance. And what's good about that book, it seems to me, is that he's quite willing to find grievance where it is. And it's on both sides of the aisle, according to Bruni. Much more so on the Republican side than the Democratic side, of course, because people are echoing what they hear from Donald Trump. And then there's a very interesting book by a political science colleague of mine, Kathy Kramer, who's at the University of Wisconsin, called The Politics of Resentment. And her story is an interesting one. She was giving talks for the Alumni Association, or maybe for the Wisconsin Foundation, in small towns and rural areas throughout Wisconsin. And she found that people in these small towns and rural areas love the University of Wisconsin for its football team and for its basketball team. The same, I think, would be true in Ohio. They really disliked the university on the academic side. It was full of socialist, if not communist, faculty who were filling their children when they sent them off to Madison or the other places in Wisconsin, which had colleges and universities, filling them with these notions that were really dangerous kinds of notions. There also was resentment because these small towns and rural areas in Wisconsin, as in Ohio, were dying. Hospitals were leaving. And in fact, there was a study that was done recently that showed that health care in small towns and rural areas is far, far worse than it is, with people dying younger than is true in metropolitan areas. So we're fortunate to live in the Columbus metropolitan area where we have all kinds of support for health care in a way that we don't have, that Ohioans don't have in some of these small towns and rural areas. And what else is happening? The kids are moving away. They don't want to be stuck in these little towns and rural areas. There are no jobs there. And so it fuels resentment. And if a candidate comes along who speaks to that resentment and tells you that I am your retribution, they are going to indeed gravitate towards that candidate. There are two other books that were both published in 2018, one by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both of them professors at Harvard, on how democracies die. And that's really good in terms of the historical picture. And they are experts, I think, Levitsky more in Latin America, Ziblatt more on Eastern Europe, but they can tell the tale of what happens to democracy and how democracies can be voted out and authoritarian leaders can come into office, mainly because elites think they can control them, just as they thought they could control Hitler back in Germany in the 1930s and Mussolini in the 1920s in Italy. And there's a book by Ashimuk called The People versus Democracy. And this is kind of an anti-populism book, because he is arguing that we should be fearful of majorities, because majorities may want to strip us of all of the rights that are foundations for democracy. And the framers got it right when they added the Bill of Rights, trying to guarantee people protections for free speech, for assembly, for religion, and for other things, against a federal government that could be captured by a majority. So an interesting book to look at. There's a book by Rachel Maddow, who some of you may follow. It's a book called Prequel, and it's a frightening story of the rise of fascism in the United States prior to World War II. And of course, the title says it all. She sees this as a prequel to what may be happening right now. And I think there, what the savior was the Roosevelt administration in office and Democrats controlling the Congress. But the fascist movement was widespread in this country. They had a champion, Lindbergh, who they were going to support if he were a presidential candidate. And then finally, there's this frightening novel by Philip Roth called The Plot Against America. And this is basically a story of how the fascists actually win the presidency and come to control the country in the 1940 election, I think it is. And there was an HBO miniseries on this. They are sending, the new government is sending Jewish children to re-education camps in the hinterland to make sure that they could root out all of these wrong notions that many of these children had. So again, if you want your blood to curdle, you could take a look at the Philip Roth book. I read that, and then I was going to read Sinclair Lewis's book, which is a similar tale about fascism, and I thought, no, I've had enough. I can't go there right now. Well, let me stop at that point and ask if you have questions, comments, or other thoughts. Please put your hand up, and I will try to recognize you. Yes, go ahead.
You know, you've been talking about just democracy. What is it about our republic, our democracy, that we are perceiving that are making people so riled up? I mean, you're talking about small towns. You're talking about people not being able to, achieve their whatever. I mean, in so many ways, this country right now is doing pretty well. So it is, something else is going on with the money in politics, corporate greed, a lot of these other things going on. Could you speak to some of them?
Well, there are a lot of things going on, obviously. And one of the lessons I think we learned from Nazi Germany and from Italy in the 1920s is that if democracy is not perceived as paying off, as functioning well, people will easily turn on it, as they did in Nazi Germany. And of course, Germany was in awful shape in the 1920s, and there was fighting going on in the streets between the communists and the fascists, the Nazis there. And Hitler never won a majority, but he won enough to take office, and there was complicity there on the part of the political elites who said, oh, this guy's an idiot, we can easily control him, which they couldn't. So it's a long story as to what's going on out there. One thing I think that it's important to emphasize is that a lot of voters get their cues from political leaders. And so if there's a political leader on the scene who is espousing extremist ideology, and that political leader is of their party, their inclination is to go along with what he or she happens to say. And that comes about because the establishment can't control, because of primaries, who it is who gets the nomination of their party. And we've seen that, of course, both in 2016, when there were all of these opponents to Donald Trump, too many of them, and he's able to win the nomination against a whole bunch of Republicans who were more or less establishment Republicans, many of whom, by the way, after he attacked them, have come to be his acolytes. So there is that. But he asks an important question, and that is, why are Americans willing to give up democracy, or at least many Americans? And I think it's because they don't see benefits from it, and they're hearing that it's problematic in many ways. I'm reminded, by the way, of another author I should have put on my list here. There's a sociologist now passed away by the name of Seymour Martin Lipset. And Lipset wrote a book called The First New Nation. And it has to do with the political development of the United States after the Constitution. And the argument that he makes in one of the chapters there is that the United States wouldn't have had such an easy course under the new Constitution if the economy had not been flourishing in the period immediately after the adoption of the Constitution. And the title of the chapter, I don't remember it offhand, but he talks about payoff, that the political system has to pay off for ordinary people, for them to be supportive of it. And if they're told over and over again it's not paying off, and they believe this despite maybe indicators to the contrary, they're going to be inclined to want to vote out the bums that are in office and vote in the alternative. So I know I haven't answered your questions, and I don't have an answer. It's a complicated matter. Yes, go ahead.
Could I add one more book for your list? Heather Cox Richardson's got a new book, The Awakening of Democracy. And the reason I mention it, I went to D.C. in '74 to work for a Democratic governor, ended up in the Senate, and ended up, all those seeds were planted back in that era, right? The unitary executive theory,
yes.
And the state legislatures. And as my political advisor next to me says, Democrats played checkers, Republicans have played chess. And we're still sitting here today playing checkers. So I hate to say it, we won big on pro-choice, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was, does the Equal Rights Amendment apply into what? So now you can go after voting rights, LGBT rights, right? There's a whole list of things.
Right.
And Clarence Thomas listed them. And we're still dabbling on the core checker when we need to be positioning ourselves way down. Because in my mind, looking back, the control of legislatures now in key Republican states,
Yes.
control the courts, thanks to Mitch McConnell and Trump, those are 30 to 40-year events that you can't change with an election, right?
Well, what we have to do here in Ohio is fix gerrymandering, and that would help. That would really help. But
our governor would say, put Biden on the ballot.
well, I think he will be on the ballot, but there'll be I know it shouldn't be an issue at all. What can I say? There are a lot of reasons why we are where we are right now, and those reasons go way back in time. Part of it, something that I had in my notes but didn't mention as I was talking, is the flow of money. And on the Republican and the conservative side, there is much more money being invested, and invested long term, in trying to change state legislatures. Part of the reason why the state legislatures in Ohio and other places are so pro-Republican is that the money had gone into gerrymandering and gone into trying to make sure that the right people were in place with funding to be able to get elected to these legislatures. So it's been there for a long time. What we need to do, obviously, as progressives and Democrats, is fight against it as hard as we can. But it's a struggle, and it's a struggle that will be ongoing. The money isn't going to go away once the the Citizens United decision was rendered. The Supreme Court basically said that if you want to get money out of politics, you've got to amend the Constitution. And that's not an easy thing to do. Okay, other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Assuming a Trump winning the election, what do you think the feasibility within a 4-year time period is of him getting the rules changed so that he would run again for a 3rd term, and also to impeach the elected 3 anti-Trump Supreme Court justices within that 4-year period?
Well, the latter would be easier than the former, because the former would take a constitutional amendment. Would he leave office willingly? There's no reason to believe that he would, based on his past behavior. Would there be a wholesale attempt to try to seek retribution against his enemies, however he defines them? Yes, I think there would be. Would the Congress be willing to go along with changes in regulations, in the tax code and the like? I think if he's elected, there would be a Republican Congress in both houses. So it's not a particularly optimistic scenario, to say the least. We would need to gird ourselves for that. I have Canadian relatives, and I've talked to them about maybe going up there, but they pointed out that they don't want old folks unless we're willing to invest a lot of money in the Canadian economy, because they don't want us taking advantage of their social safety net. And I understand that. Okay, other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Talking about Trump obviously being retribution and stuff. Lyndon Johnson was also. Trump is worse than Lyndon Johnson was.
Say that again. I didn't hear all of it.
Talking about how vindictive Trump is.
Oh, yes.
Lyndon Johnson was also reviewed to be very vindictive. Trump is worse than Johnson.
Oh, absolutely. And worse than Nixon. Nixon was vindictive. And Nixon unleashed the IRS on some of his enemies. Fortunately, there was a professional structure in place where people resisted those kinds of things. That, I think, would be gone under a new Trump administration. It takes some time for it to be totally gone, but he would staff the federal government with loyalists. And just think of the Justice Department, for instance, or the FBI, for that matter, or Homeland Security of all departments. Again, this is not probably what I would say to this mixed audience that I was talking about making this presentation to, but I think it's a frightening prospect going forward. Okay, other questions, comments, thoughts? So let me go here and then over there.
Don't you think for women voting this time around will make a big difference?
Oh, I think women voting this time around do make a big difference. And one of the changes, I think so. One of the big changes that's occurred in the party bases is that women now are much more likely to be Democrats than men are. And it's men who have been the ones that are kind of fueling the Trump emergence and support. I think issues like abortion, although it's not just freedom of choice, it's more than that. And I think that, and also women, at least according to the polls, don't like his style. They don't like the bully style that he has signified. And so I think women would matter. The big battles going on, I think, in the 2024 election are going to be in the suburbs. It's going to be for the votes of educated women. And we'll see what happens there. It's been favorable to the Democrats in the last couple of election cycles. One hopes it will be favorable to them before. One of the things that has worried me, by the way, is that younger people seem to be both turned off by Biden, but also turned off by Trump. These are the two most unpopular presidential candidates we've had in my lifetime. Since the beginning of public opinion polling, in fact. And the question is, what's going to happen as a result of that? Will people just refuse to vote? And one worries about young people not turning out to vote because they're the ones who will pay the price if there's a second Trump presidency. Now, there was something over here, I think.
Just a quick
Yes,
question.
go ahead.
Any views on the root of all evil being the repeal of the equal time doctrine?
Well, the equal time doctrine is part of it. I think, though, it only applied really to the broadcast media. And what we've seen, of course, now is people turning more and more to cable networks and to social media. And so I think it wouldn't have mattered in the long run.
So it's the combination of the proliferation of talk radio
Yes.
and...
Yes, I should add that I'm trained as a social scientist to see multiple causes of things, and we certainly are in a world of multiple causes here, any one of which is important, but together they're even more important. Now, there was a question. Yes, go ahead.
Two comments. One, I heard Dr. Thomas Sowell speaking about one of the declines. The trouble we're in right now is change the voting age. So he started to defend his argument. He ended up with somehow getting to the age of about 35. I started voting in 1968. So when we rented that right, my father made sure, coming from that generation that fought World War II, that I was going to be there, voting for somebody. You didn't know really, you did, honestly. I wouldn't be here today. But that was, this is what I thought. Get up there and take care of business. I thought that was kind of ironic. I heard somewhere or read someplace that somebody was thinking, well, maybe we should go to 25. But that's going to take some law passing.
Well, if we had gone to 25 4 years ago, and during the Obama era, Republicans probably would have won those elections. So I don't want to do that. I'm hopeful that the youngsters will see the light. I'm sorry?
Guys go out and die at 18.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about the? I never thought there'd be a day I would be rooting for a change, but what factor that some of those rhinos might play? Do we really know yet?
I was hopeful that they would be the ones who would lead a lot of reasonable Republicans not to vote for Trump. It hasn't worked that way to date. Liz Cheney, I think, has been remarkable in that she is very conservative, there's no question about that. But she also has, I think, recognized the kind of threat that Donald Trump is, both to her party and to conservatism. And has been quite willing to sacrifice her political career for that. There are very few Liz Cheneys. And of course, the sad thing about those few is that they're mostly gone from the scene. And will they be active in the campaign? I think she is going to be, and she's going to do everything she can to try to make sure that he is not reelected as president. But I'm not sure it's going to amount. No, I don't want to say it that way. I'm not sure it's going to lead large numbers of people to vote the other way.
I think that if she does, there'll be a lot of people that will be like hidden Democrats. Either they won't vote for Trump, or they'll tell all their friends they did, and then they vote the other way.
Yeah, the key in 2024 is going to be turnout. And if Democrats are not able, that's people like us, right, are not able to mobilize voters who see things the same way we do, then I think the Trump forces are going to be victorious. Now, again, there may be mobilization issues on the Republican side of the aisle as well. And we'll just see what happens. And of course, I give another talk that is a preview of the 2024 election. And one of the things I say there is that it's now May. And a lot could happen between now and the election. A lot could happen between now and the conventions, in fact. And two of the big things that could happen have to do with Trump's legal problems, and secondly, the health of the two presumptive nominees. And I just celebrated is not the right term, just had my 80th birthday. And I recognize that health can be precarious at that age. And, we're talking about months before the conventions themselves. And then what would happen if either party or both parties have to come up with different candidates? It'd be interesting. Well, interesting is not the right term. It'd be frightening to see that. Yes, go ahead.
Don't you find that it's a positive sign that so many people voted for Nikki Haley? And seems like some of those people would not vote for Trump.
Yes, I do, actually. I mean, there is a group within the Republican Party, loyal Republicans in many ways, who couldn't stomach Trump. Now, what are they going to do in the general election? Will they come back home to the Republican Party? The evidence from previous years is that Republicans vote Republican and Democrats vote Democratic. And so will they come back home? I don't know. Haley is not helping them come back home, as other Republicans who you would never think of as people who would endorse Trump, saying that, well, they're going to vote for him, even though he's done all these horrible things. I don't know. There may be enough there that there would be some erosion in the Republican base, but whether Biden would be able to pick up that erosion and convert those people into Democratic voters, I simply don't know. Now, yes, go ahead.
I should probably know this, but what happened to Trump or Biden die in late October after voting has already started and the ballots have been printed and millions of votes have already been cast?
Well, they would still be on the ballots, of course, in late October. The national committees would be the ones who have the authority to pick the substitutes. That would be interesting. You could expect the Republican National Committee to pick Don Jr., right? It's got to stay in the family. And who the Democrats would pick, who knows? It probably would be the vice presidential candidate. But still, October, even if they would either die or be convicted and jailed, well, one of them anyway, convicted and jailed before the convention, what would the convention do? I think the Republican convention would go ahead and nominate Trump. But
there's nothing barring him serving as president or jail.
That's right. The anecdote I always love to tell my students was that I grew up in Indiana, and there's a county called Lake County, which is right next to Chicago. And there were two Lake County office holders who were convicted, no, I'm not going to say this right, who were charged with bribes. One of them was convicted, the other one was not. And the one who was not had declared the bribes as gifts on his income tax returns. And so he had violated no laws. The other one went to jail and was in prison for several years. When he came out of prison, he ran for office again, because in Indiana, you couldn't vote if you'd ever been convicted as a felony, but you could run for office. He ran for office and won in Lake County. And again, that was a long time ago, but it's an interesting parlor game to think about what would happen if either of these candidates couldn't go all the way to the general election itself. And that's uncharted territory. We don't quite know what would happen over time. Okay, other questions? I've probably gone on. Yes, go ahead.
I'm reluctant to ask this, but I'm wondering it. I see a lot of ads on TV for Biden now, but I'm not seeing them for that Moreno guy, Bernie Moreno's running for the Senate, right? After they had that huge thing during the primaries, there's nothing coming up. And I'm wondering, do you have any idea what that's about?
Well, I think the campaigns try to decide, to strategize as to when they ought to run their ads. And I think the Biden campaign has wanted to run ads early, and they have the money to be able to do that. The Trump campaign hasn't yet run a lot. Now, I should backtrack for just a minute. A lot of these ads are not run by the campaign, not paid for by the campaigns. They are paid for by political action committees that cannot coordinate with the campaigns, but there's a wink and a nod there often, so there is some coordination that is going on. And then the most negative of the ads are not by the political action committees of the candidates or of the candidate campaign itself. They're independent groups who are able to spend money as of Citizens United, and you don't even know where the money has come from, who has done the spending. But I think you'll see plenty of ads. I had a colleague who visited me some years ago, and it was during the presidential campaign, the fall campaign, and he was from Massachusetts. And he said, "Oh, it's so nice to be in Ohio. I actually see ads, and I know what's going on." And after 3 days here, he said, "I'm so eager to go back to Massachusetts because I'm so tired of seeing these negative ads that are over and over again." We'll see plenty of ads. And the Marino campaign and his supporters will have millions of dollars. In fact, the estimate is that the two campaigns, Sherrod Brown's and Bernie Marino's, will probably spend upwards of $100 million.
Sure, it's the ads for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe what I should say.
It's good for the television stations, but not good probably for anybody else. Okay, I think I've gone on probably too long. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation tonight. I really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you. Good to be here.